The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. I'm delighted to be bringing you another chapter from 100 Orchestration Tips, this time from the newly revised 2nd edition, which was just released last week. This is one of my favorite tips, especially because I often see developing orchestrators taking Rimsky-Korsakov's advice on balancing brass instruments a little too far. Hopefully, the advice on this video will clear up a lot of questions. The orchestrator should consider color as much as perceived equations of dynamic balance when scoring for brass. There are some comparative dynamic values that orchestration manuals bandy about, which individually seem to make sense, but collectively don't always add up. According to Rimsky-Korsakov, one group of violins equals one flute, 2 flutes equals 1 horn, 2 horns equals 1 trumpet. If a composer were to adhere strictly to this math, it would be impossible to score anything. One would need 8 groups of strings instead of the normal 5 in order to balance with the 8 standard wind players or even just a single trumpet. Fortunately, that's not the way things work, which one can easily see with the most rudimentary score reading. The problem with this math is that it deals with all instruments purely on a perceived and constant level of volume. But there's so much more to it than that. Most orchestral instruments can balance quite nicely at mezzo-piano and under without having to consider this kind of math too much. Some instruments project far better than others, like the tuba. And of course, the players themselves are constantly adjusting to each other's levels of volume, for the simple necessity of being able to hear one another, if nothing else. Here's a far more useful general dynamic calculation. Start with the strings as the average weight of tone and projection. That is your 0 line. From there, you must decide whether to augment that tone through support and/or doubling, or contrast it with interplay between groups of instruments. The winds are the usual partners in this, playing solos, interacting in different ways, or joining in on combined coloration. There will be greater potential weight in the winds, especially in terms of individual lines, but the sense of projection may lessen on harmonies as the winds spread out across a chord. Depending on the context of the music, the winds should be able to play alongside the strings without too much fiddling around dynamically, as in marking dynamics up or down to compensate, etc. If the winds bridge between the strings and the brass, they help move that 0 line forward. Now the quite powerful brass may balance more easily with the rest of the orchestra. It's really when the strings and brass interact that the most care is needed. This is all still the coldest of mathematical proportions, but music is a living art, and it changes from day to day and orchestra to orchestra. Beyond questions of balance, there's the color of the music to consider, which can and should have a much greater impact on the correct proportions. Endless calculations over which part should be louder or more tightly grouped may be completely disregarded in some textures. Let's consider the brass section as its own unique problem and set of variables, and really look at why some instruments appear stronger than others. A brass instrument mostly behaves like a wind instrument in terms of tone production. The embouchure creates a tone at the mouthpiece, which sets up a waveform through the bore of the instrument. The length of the bore and the harmonic frequency determine the pitch. These factors are all the same so far. Now for the differences. The walls of the bore are extremely thin compared to the winds, and made of metal which encourages greater intensity of vibration. Then there's the bell of a brass instrument. Sounds are somewhat directional in projection, which is why the brass section sits in the back of the orchestra, pointing forward. These factors have a bearing on balance within the brass section as well as without. The horn, for instance, has a smaller mouthpiece than most other brass. It also has a wide bell that points behind the player, spreading the sound in the opposite direction to the listener. Though its range is around the same as a tenor trombone, its gently conical bore results in a more mellow tone. These factors combine to give the horn a more limited field of projection than its counterparts. Trumpets and trombones, on the other hand, are simple cylindrical pipes with a flaring bell in their last one-third or so of length. There's an enormous advantage here in terms of projection, because a more penetrating tone with a shallower resonance will come straight out of the end of that bell. Finally, though tubas usually point to the ceiling, they have some of the most far-reaching projection of all with their large mouthpieces and widely conical bores. This has naturally led to a divide in the way that the brass section is described. There are the horns, and then there are the heavy brass, essentially everyone else. The horns interact with the winds and support the strings, and the heavy brass stand more on their own. But what happens when the horns stand with the heavy brass? The common wisdom, as passed down by Rimsky-Korsakov, is to treat the horns as half the strength of trumpets, trombones, and tuba. He provides several charts illustrating full, rich chords, in which the horns sit 2 to a note in chords of one heavy brass player per note. These chords are all quite full and satisfying, but they tend to suggest that the only way to bring a horn quartet up to strength is to double it to 8 members, and indeed many scores take this approach. And yet this isn't always the way. Rimsky-Korsakov himself admits that in wider spaced chords, 4 horns may fill in the middle at 1 horn per note. I'd go further. The type of full-bodied chord structures that he recommends are simply one kind of orchestral color. They don't serve as a guideline for what to do in brass harmonies all or even most of the time. Many full-bodied textures have been structured where all brass are more or less equal partners, as the strongest register of each has been scored. Still other chords are built which are lighter, darker, more menacing, or more placid, none of which involve the brute force approach of 2 horns equals 1 trumpet. So score read for this detail, and compare the colors of the many different ways that brass textures are proportioned. There's currently a sale going on over on orchestrationonline.com for both this new release and last year's book, 100 More Orchestration Tips, plus further savings on the 2 books bundled together. If you haven't picked up a copy of 100 Orchestration Tips yet, this is a pretty cost-effective opportunity. And if you already do have a copy, I have a low-cost upgrade option. This sale runs through to the end of June 2021, so if you're interested, then grab a copy soon. Thanks to everyone for your support of this channel and for being part of our online orchestration community. See you soon for more useful content, and stand by for news about this year's Orchestration Challenge.